Welcome to Around the Writer's Table, a podcast focusing on the crossroads of creativity, craft, and conscious living for writers of all ages and backgrounds. Your hosts are Gina, Melody, and Kimbu, three close friends and women of a certain age who bring to the table their eclectic backgrounds and unique perspectives on the trials, tribulations, and the joys of writing. So pull up a chair and get comfortable here around the writer's table.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Around the Writer's Table. I'm Gina Hogan Edwards, and I'm here today with a special guest. We've talked about doing alternating shows for you guys. You're going to hear from Kimbu and Melody and I every other episode, and then we're going to have special guests. We've started back a few episodes ago with Rhett Devane, and then today I am here with author Pat Spears. Welcome, Pat. Glad to have you here with us.
Thank you.
So let me tell you a little bit about Pat. I'm fortunate enough to know her here in our local writing community and know a little bit about the kinds of books that she writes and the themes that she gets into. So let me introduce you to her. She is the author of 3 novels and many, many short stories. Her second novel, It's Not Like I Knew Her, received the Bronze Award for LGBTQ fiction from Forward Review. Her short stories have appeared in numerous journals, including North American Review, Sinister Wisdom, Appalachian Heritage, Common Lives, Lesbian Lives, and Seven Hills Review, and also in anthologies titled Law and Disorder from Main Street Rags, Bridges and Borders from Jane's Stories Press, Saints and Sinners, New Fiction from the Festival 2012, and Walking the Edge, which is a Southern Gothic anthology from Twisted Road Publications. Her short story, Whelping, and this is something new that I didn't know, it was a finalist for the Rash Award, and it appears in the 2014 issue of Broad River Review. She's a 6th-generation Floridian and lives in Tallahassee, Florida, not too far from me, with her partner, 2 dogs, and 1 rabbit. Welcome, Pat. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Gina. I'm happy to be here with you and your audience, and I look forward to talking about writing.
So we do have a lot to talk about. You know, you get us writers together and we could go on and on and on, which we've had the good fortune to do off camera. Today we're going to talk about, let's start out with what got you into writing. When did you start doing it? Just give us a little bit of background about your writing.
Okay. Let me begin by saying that I grew up with the rich front porch storytelling tradition, and my grandmother and my dad could spin spellbinding tales. And at an early age, I remember asking my granny, if we can use granny here,
Of course.
after one of her stories, if it was a true story. She laughed and said to me that stories were just lies and more lies, but there was always truth in every lie. And I was 10 years old, and I think I'm just learning to understand what she meant by that. That is, of course, lies are a major portion of the novel that I've just written, and maybe it goes back there. But I also want to say that I read my way through my small fiction section of my high school library, and it was not uncommon for my math teachers especially to start any class with telling me to put up a book. Maybe that's why my math skills are not everything you would hope they would be. But my first writing and publications were, of course, for professional journals, state, national. My earliest notion that I might be able to write fiction, or even did I entertain the idea, was when I was writing case studies from primary sources in a textbook that Helen Deans and I were writing at the time. I adapted those primary sources for youngsters who would not probably be persuaded to read the history book because this was Florida history. And so it was several years before I purchased Writing Fiction. I have to read the title. Writing Fiction, A Guide to Narrative Craft, third edition by Janet Burway.
Yeah.
And that's the classic, comprehensive, even now, guide to writing. And I naively thought, okay, I can teach myself to be a fiction writer. Mm-hmm. But that was a little like, digging a hole, dropping a plant in, watering it when you remembered it, and deciding that you would become a master gardener. Mm. And it was not long before I decided I need more help, that this wasn't going to actually work. So the first thing I did, because I was a student at FSU for quite a while, I joined a class by Jerry Stern and Janet Burway.
Yes.
And I was the oldest person in the class. And when Janet took a serious interest in my writing, it gave me enough confidence to go ahead and sign up for a week-long workshop with Connie Mae Fowler and Dorothy Allison. And it was yes, that's where it all started. With that experience, I decided if I worked really hard and I wrote something every day, that I could become a fiction writer. And that's really how I got started. But with those two wonderful writers, it was quite a send-off. I remember driving back from St. Augustine thinking, oh my gosh, am I glad I did that. It was, and some of the writers in that group, we are still communicating with each other. Oh. And I believe that was in 2008, that long ago.
I didn't realize some of the similarities in background that you and I have, the beginnings in sort of the business writing arena, but still being somewhat storytelling oriented. Of course, the granny on the porch, definitely have the storytellers in my family who boy, they can spin a yarn. And yeah. Going to FSU, I also got to take classes from Janet Burway, but I got there after Jerry Stern was gone, unfortunately.
Yes, Jerry Stern and I were neighbors at that time.
Oh, lucky you. And then to, go on a writing workshop with Dorothy Allison. Wow.
I know it. And I just talked to her yesterday.
Wow.
We have been, and she says we are comrades on this journey. And she is wonderful. And Connie is as well, but Connie has all of this magnificent work she has going on, and Dorothy's kind of in a not writing as much as she did for a while.
Yeah.
But it's always good to go back to her.
I love the alliances that we that we form as writers. And that's one of the things I appreciate about our Tallahassee community. I think we have here in the Panhandle and I've bragged about this so much before, we have such a cohesive, supportive writing community, and there are a lot of writers out there who do not have that privilege. And that was one of the reasons that I created the Women Writing for Change Facebook group and started doing the Zoom sessions that we do, because there are people in very remote areas, or they just don't have any writers in their lives. And, their family thinks they're crazy because they spin these yarns.
Well, I can tell you a story about my mother, if this fits into the same kind of idea. The first short story I had published, I was really excited about, and I gave it to my mother to read, which was a mistake, because what she said was, well, I really wish you'd write about nice people.
Mm.
And it kind of messed me up. And I said, oh, but Mom, I don't know any. What she was talking about are the kinds of characters I choose to write about.
Yes.
The ones that so many people would believe they don't know and don't wish to know.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk them into liking these people.
Well, that brings us then to your book, your newest book that's coming out September 16th, I believe it is.
That is correct. Yes.
Hotel Impala, your third novel, am I right?
That is correct. Yes.
So give us a brief description of that.
All right. The story is told from multiple points of view, which is the first time I've attempted that. And it covers roughly over a period of 7 years. The voices are principally the mother, Leah, her husband, Daniel, and their older of the two daughters, Grace. Grace is, for me, the character that I first fell in love with, which I think is absolutely essential for me to start really caring about this young. When the book starts, she is 11 years old. And I think that was really a start for me, because I felt so connected to her.
Mm.
And I think probably the best way to talk about the book is to read the back cover, because it's the best statement, rather than going into some kind of synopsis
Yes.
situation.
And we don't want any spoilers anyway, because we
absolutely
read
not.
it. Full disclosure to listeners, I have not been able to read the book yet, and so I've heard bits and pieces. I've read the synopsis, read some other reviews of the book, and I'm like, I can't wait. I especially want to meet Grace, because as you know, Pat, the main character in my novel, is a young girl as well. So I'm anxious to meet these characters. Yeah. So go ahead and read that back cover for us, if you would.
Yeah, okay. This, of course, is, and I'm not going to read from the book itself. I'm going to read from an insert. Lilia Killian has long since given up on silencing the noises that reverberate through her mind. Her one comfort comes with knowing she will never be alone in her madness. Her 12-year-old daughter, Grace, has promised she will never leave her, even as she travels more precarious roads after another in search of anything that will lessen her pain. For Grace, there was once life on a quiet suburban street where she and her sister Zoe dutifully repeated the family mantra, "Our mom is fine. It's just that she sometimes lives inside of her head." But as Leo becomes increasingly untethered from reality, chasing one grand scheme after another, and searching for the magical whooping crane she believes will cure her, Grace finds herself in the worst place yet, Motel Mount Pleasant, with its drugs, hookers, and a pimp prying her little sister with chocolates.
Mm.
It is here that Grace must finally surrender the hope and denial that has sustained her and make a choice: keep her promise to her mother, or keep herself and her little sister safe.
Ooh. So there is a lot in that we're gonna touch on here shortly. But before we do that, I'd love to know, are you able to sort of backtrack to, was there like one spark of inspiration or, something that led you to this story?
I have a notion that's Southern for lots of ways of talking, but decades ago, I was a graduate student and teaching assistant at Florida State University. I drove away from the library late. It was in February because my birthday was coming up. And as I approached the intersection at Woodward and Tennessee Street, I caught sight of a man and woman my age or slightly older, and a child, maybe 3 or 4. They were huddled together beneath the street light. The boy sat slumped on what I thought was a cardboard suitcase. And I imagined him both hungry and tired and cold. He leaned against the woman I took to be his mother. And I wondered at the time, what does a mother say to a child that is cold, hungry, and tired? The light changed and I drove on. But at the time, I thought I should stop, but I didn't know what I could do. At that point, I was in classes where this scene was a concept. It wasn't real. And years later, after this image of this child has stayed with me, I can see it clearly even today.
Mm.
Voices, when I heard Grace's voice, then it reminded me of that. And I wondered, and maybe I even believed, it was an echo of that little boy
Oh.
to whom I'd failed to respond. I wanted to believe that a random encounter decades earlier had placed a seed, a story seed, an emotional response. And perhaps it is true, for me anyway, that our hearts hold memories, waiting for our conscious minds to catch up.
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, thank you for sharing that. It is that really exemplifies the magical nature of the stories that sometimes come forth. I wonder, as Grace came to you, was it in that moment of her coming to you and you remembering that boy that you realized that he might be the inspiration? Or was it only now in reflection after having written the book that you can look back and say, Grace was maybe a reflection of that boy, an echo of that boy?
Well, in terms of, I heard Grace's voice.
Mm-hmm.
I tell people I hear voices in my head. And and it was her dialogue that I heard first.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought back. It was like all of a sudden I thought back, oh my gosh. And then it filled me with, at first it was sadness. And I don't want to say I'm going, oh, now I can make up for being unhelpful, but it was important. It was very important because I recognized it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, I have to figure out as a writer how I answer that question. How would I answer the child?
Yes.
And
Yes.
then it was a story.
So from the back cover that you read, it's apparent that, you know, mental illness and homelessness are big parts of Hotel Impala. Also, it's a story of the lies that people tell themselves. You know, we all have secrets, right? And sometimes we tell those lies to protect ourselves. Sometimes we tell those lies to protect other people in our lives. But we cannot tell lies and have to live those lies without having them affect the choices that we have to make. And so
Exactly.
I'd love to hear more from you about how that plays a part in your story and why that was something that was important for you to write about as well.
Yeah. I think the epigraph of the novel really says it all. And I read this, things come apart so easily when they're held together with lies. And that's from Dorothy Allison
Mm.
and A Bastard Out of Carolina. I think that sometimes we as writers want to write safely. And by that I mean we want to anticipate what readers are going to think about what we're writing. And it kind of ties us up, I think. It has a restriction that we choose to put on ourselves. And when I read and talk with Dorothy about this kind of thing, then that is very true, I think. And exactly what was happening in the family, where the children were expected to respond in a certain way, even within the family structure, that their mom was fine. She just sometimes lives inside her head.
Mm-hmm.
And I, I think also I had a conversation with a really dear friend writer just last week, and she expressed concern about writing something that family would not understand or want other people to know. And I think that happens to us.
Of course.
I, yeah, yeah. And that we try to write as truthfully as we possibly can. And it's like Granny says, you know, that there's some truth in every lie.
Yes.
And I think it's taken me quite a while to understand what that really means. And I'll have to rediscover it if I choose to write another book,
Yeah.
or even write another short story.
We have to
And I'll
remember
tell you,
that every time, right?
every sentence, if you want to get that drastic about it. But I can remember being in a workshop group, and I have some a point of view about when you can do that too much. And I had a short story, and someone said, "Oh, I hate that mother," and it was shocking to me, and dismissed the entire story. I hate that mother. And I took that story, this is on me, 100% on me. I took the story and I put it away.
Mm.
I thought, oh, God, that must be really awful. And then I just came back to that very same. I write short fiction between novels. And so when I pulled that story out and I thought, what's the matter with that story? I love that story. And so I didn't change anything. And then I submitted it and it got selected for second place in a contest. And I'm going, I wish I'd have had more confidence in me than to let that bother me. So sometimes if you don't get, sometimes it isn't that the person in your workshop is trying to help you be a better writer for your story rather than sitting as a critic. You got to be real careful with that. There are readers. There were 5 people who read Hotel Impala for me early on. And the best advice I got was from a fellow writer who simply said, you know how to move another step in your writing, journeyman writer to a better writer? Talk about lies. And I go, oh my Lord. So I went back and there were some pretty substantial revisions, but that was the best piece of advice I got. And another one said, for a scene that I had written, I just don't buy that. And I trust that woman. And I went back and made some revisions. So that process is extremely useful, but you gotta have enough confidence, I think, to say, no, that's my story. You write your story. I write my story. And, then that sometimes can hurt people's feelings and stuff gets mixed up.
Staying true to the story is, I've talked about that a lot, and I think you and I probably share a similar opinion about writing workshops and critique groups and so forth. You have to be careful who you show your early work to, and show it to people who've really earned the right to see it and whose wisdom you respect, but also be able to be discerning about what they say to you, whether it's right for that story or not. And as far as being concerned about readers, I had an instructor say to me once that what he hopes his stories do is elicit a reaction from the readers, and he cannot control what the reaction is, but he wants a reaction. And I've held that.
Yeah, well, hold on to that, because this book that I just finished challenged me more than I've ever been challenged about that very thing. How do I end this book?
I can't wait to read it, Pat. I really can't wait to read it.
I went around for months telling myself, no, I do not want to write that. So I was arguing with myself, not some stranger out here was telling me something. And then I met a police officer, and we sat together at a Second Harvest event, and we talked. And she made me believe, no, story doesn't end that way. Thank you. Thank you.
And we never know when we're going
now
to.
You have to read it to figure out what I'm talking about.
Well, like I said, I can't wait. But we never know when we're going to be gifted these moments that have nothing to do with, writing necessarily, but gifted with these moments of exchange with other people that inform where we're going with the story.
Right. And of course, her experience was so real. She was out there every day. And I'd never met this person before, but I trusted her judgment.
Yeah. Awesome.
And I'm going, because I needed, where we talk about in politics now, I needed permission to write that.
Yeah.
And she didn't say, no, she's not a writer. She didn't tell me how to write it. but she made me feel that my instincts were good. That thing we call writer tuition. No,
Yes.
that's not the word.
Intuition.
Intuition. Thank you for
Yes.
that.
Yes.
See, I need help all along the way.
We all do, Pat. That's why we're here for each other.
Yeah.
So one question that always comes up among authors, and I always like to ask this question of any writer that I encounter, is about their writing process. So I'd love to know more about your process, either specifically on this book or in general. You know, we're all told, you know, if you're going to be a real writer, you got to write every day. And, you know, that's not necessarily true.
I hope
I think
not.
we need to write regularly, but not necessarily every day. So just when you're actively writing, what does that look like for you?
I'm not a writer that begins with an outline. No, no way. For the process begins when I start to hear voices, and it's broken dialogue usually, and that particular thing's going to show up in the book at one time or another. But then I start to, if it persists, I go, uh-oh, it's like fishing. I got a nibble.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, okay, who is that? Who's the voice? What are they trying to tell me? And I keep doing that. I don't really have any idea how the story's going to end. I just trust the character to start triggering thoughts about that, and I start to write scenes around those voices. I hear Grace, and it takes a time before I even know the name and who she is. And I certainly don't know anything about the relationships of Grace to anyone. But I start to write scenes around her so I can hear her voice. And then that triggers relationships, and I start to build the story. But I built stories, oddly enough, and one of my dear friends calls that my back-assered way of writing, where I write scenes and then I'll go over here and write a totally different scene with a different voice. And I keep doing that scene by scene, and I build a complete story. And it's probably a third of the way before I start to understand, yes. And then I start saying, how do I put all these scenes together? It's like a puzzle. I have a puzzle out here in pieces, and I start trying to fit it together. And I then start to arrange those scenes in some kind of story, some kind of sequence. There's a rhythm and there's a pacing to all of that. And then I have to write smaller pieces that help put those together. I sometimes imagine it. Did you have Tinker Toys when you were a kid?
Yes.
You know, the spool with all the little holes in it. I've got this part. I've got better get to the camera. I've got the spools. I've got the pieces, the scenes. Now I got to fit them together with the little sticks. You remember, whatever they're called. And then I start to put the story together. But the good thing for me is that no, it doesn't go that way. Then I can remove the little connectors, which are the transitional pieces, and I can move them around without having to start back over here. The one thing that I do not want to do when I write is open the story and then proceed to write 20 pages of description of people, what they look like, what what their car looks like or whatever people, because somebody somewhere said you got to write descriptions all the time. So what bothers me the most is I do not want to have what I call a runway. It's like you can't get on the highway. You can't get to the story. You're just, you're pumping out 20 pages. And I guarantee you, no, I can't say that. I would suggest to you that if you send that out to somebody to read, they're not going to read your 20 pages of what color lipstick Mary Beth was wearing.
Mm-hmm.
You want to start the story, and you want to make that the first. I never write the first 5 or 10 pages of a book. I would not even begin to imagine a novel where I could write the first 10 pages as the beginning, because I don't know the story. Now, if you have an outline, you can go zip, 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 zip right through, I guess. I don't know. I've never been able to do that. So I try to avoid a runway, and I try to start the story as close as I possibly can. So when you've read the first 5 pages, you're going to have a pretty good idea about this book. Does that make any sense?
It all makes perfect sense.
Process. Now, my habit is another issue. Initially, I thought I had to write every day.
Mm-hmm.
I would get up at 6:30 in the morning, and I would start writing, and I would write as long as the juice flowed. And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to be a writer. This is going to work. But now, since I have issue with sitting for any length of time because of major back surgery, I now am a much slower writer. But the problem I have is that I can't sit for more than an hour and a half at any one time, which breaks my concentration. And so I'm now very much slower writer. But to talk about a process is difficult for me, because I think everybody makes that discovery on their own in time. What works for you may not even approach what somebody else does. So I don't really know how useful it is. I try to write. I work on something. Whether I spend every day doing that, no. There's reflection time.
Yeah.
I walk around with a story in my head,
Mm-hmm.
to the point it's probably risky, but I don't write it down. I've got to think it through. And then I go and I write it.
I think your point
I
is
don't
well
know.
taken, that we have to discover for ourselves what works, because what works for me is not going to work for you, vice versa. I think it's useful to hear other people's process, because sometimes we can get into a rut, or sometimes we can get into just a pattern of thinking that this is the way it works for me. And hearing how other people do it, I think opens up possibility for something that they might try. You talking about writing the scenes and having the scenes and then interconnecting them is very similar to the way that I write. And building
Good.
those
I
bridges.
thought it was me.
No,
Yeah.
maybe we're weird. Wouldn't doubt it.
I hope so.
But that's very similar to the way that I write. And then I have to go back and figure out, okay, what is the best sequence of these scenes? Because on the surface, sometimes they can look very unconnected. And
Right.
how do I bridge to make this make sense?
Yeah. And how much do you want the reader to know? Uh, you know, I I try I try to write it in a way that it becomes a page turner, and whatever that truly means, because I give you just enough to make you curious about what happens next. A really good friend of mine told me once that she read Dream Chaser, which was my first book, and she read it. And when her husband would come home, he would say, "Okay, what'd you read today?" And then she'd tell him, and he'd say, "Well, what happened next?" And that's kind of the way you hope somebody will come to your story. That there's just always a nugget there that you have to answer later.
Yeah,
Don't spell it all out.
I've actually found it a bit of a challenge. It's like there's what the writer knows, and there's what you want the reader to know at a certain time in the story. And so playing that balancing act of knowing when to reveal things to the reader that I, as the writer, already know about the characters or the situation is a real important aspect of the delivery of the story, I think.
Yeah. And another aspect of that is when you write and you think and then someone reads it, like your editor, and it says, what is this? And I go into this thing about explaining it, and they're going, "No, my dear, it is not on the page. It's still up here."
Yes.
So those become the missing pieces, It's like, oh, okay. One of the most difficult things for me is revisions. I know that I'll never write the perfect story, even with major revisions, but I'd hold on to certain phrases, certain words, certain explanations long past their really being very useful. And I hate to give up anything. And the worst thing anybody can do to me is change my words. Tell me what you want to tell me about it, and I'll listen because I want to know. But don't rewrite it for me. I made the mistake very much in the very, very beginning of giving it to someone, a short story, and they immediately took out their pen and started rewriting it for themselves. I mean, like they would write it.
Yeah.
And I didn't know how to say, no. It's my story. Yeah. Help me write my story better. But
so
your
story and how it begins, I can't wait to read the whole thing, but I'm hoping that maybe you want to share a little bit with us about the beginning of the story, maybe.
Yes, I really would like to read the first page. This is called, it's not an elevator speech because I don't know how to do that. But this particular, let me read it off of here. Can you give me a timeout here?
Sure.
Okay. Take a bit for me to find it. Oops, come back. Okay, what I'd like to read, not from the book, but from my iPad. This is page 1, and it's Grace's voice. And she's 11 years old. And I had to be careful about telling this complicated story in the voice of a child. So I had to write what it is a child understands about their family and their circumstances, because I don't know who wants to listen just to an 11-year-old child. But this is from Grace. The school bus pulled away, and Grace glanced back toward home. She sometimes still imagined their mom standing in front of the purple door, waving long after the bus has rounded the corner and vanished from sight. Zoe dared not as much as a backward glance, but hugged her backpack to her chest as though a substitute for all she needed. She's 5. Mom waved, didn't she? Zoe's eyes were focused elsewhere. You tell me, her sister's improbable optimism too early wore on Grace's own resilience. The glimmer of hope slid from Zoe's face, replaced by a pinched expression, and she squeezed her backpack even tighter. Regretting her harshness, Grace leaned and whispered, Dad said she'll soon be well enough to volunteer at the animal shelter again. That's good, right? But she knew Dad, too, often chose hope when there was nothing else to offer. Zoe chewed on a bleeding cuticle, and Grace knew only one of her better stories, drawn from her earlier memories of their mom and baby Zoe, would satisfy her sister. Zoe never stopped begging for more of Grace's stories, peppered with plenty of Grace's sweetest lies, the worst part of living in stories that were never completely true was Grace's fear of someday running dry of stories, leaving her and Zoe to live fully inside their mother's tilted realities. That's page 1.
You've got me wanting more.
And I think what I was trying to talk about earlier about what you tell the reader, and when you choose to tell it, and you start right in the middle, you start right in with what's happening. I want to be active, and I want the reader to go, "Ooh, okay."
You made a little bit of reference to the point of view. You tell this story from you don't stay with Grace for the entire novel, although she's in the whole story, but you alternate points of view in the story.
Yes, I do. It's from Leah, the mother, Daniel, the father, and Grace.
Okay.
Grace is the driving voice.
Mm.
Grace is the perspective that you build in a novel. And it is when Grace responds, when I said earlier, she promised her mother that she'd never leave her. And then the story becomes one precarious road after another as Leah loses more and more of her grasp of reality. And in the end, it is that promise that keeps Grace tethered to her mother. And it's when that is challenged by a character that shows up that I hadn't expected at all. And I go, wow, that's the way to do that.
Yeah.
And let me go back, if I can, and say one thing about the arrival of new characters. And you go, wow, they become magic in terms of connecting all of this. In the end, there is a character named Moses who declares that he's never tried to lead anybody anywhere they didn't want to go, which is kind of a little smirk for me. And he saves me in the end. And he only appears probably this far in the book. Moses comes on scene. He does his thing that is magical and walks away.
I am excited for September 16th. Would you share with our listeners about how they're going to be able to find Hotel Impala? Where can they get it?
Where can they get it?
Yes.
They can get it directly from the sale page on Twisted Road. They can get it from any other source that they typically go to. It won't be difficult.
Is Twisted Road, is it twistedroadpublications.com or twisted.road.com? Do you know the web address? We will put that in our show notes. So if you
I
don't
do not
remember
know
the.
that, but
Okay,
I can get that information for you.
I'll make
I-
sure that we get that in the show notes.
Yeah, that would be the clearest and the most correct way to go about it, because I don't pay a lot of attention to that sort of thing. I should, I guess, but I don't, because I don't have to. I'm lucky.
I have learned so many new things about you as a writer, and of course about your new book. This has been a delightful conversation. I appreciate your time in visiting with us, and I
Oh.
hope our listeners get a lot from this as well.
I do too, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you and your viewers. And yeah, I'm excited about the 16th. But as always, I'm a little bit nervous. I think you understand that.
Oh yeah, that's all
Most
part
writers
of the
do.
process too, isn't it?
It's that wonderful mix, like
Yeah. So
thank
do you
you.
have another book in the works? I know this wasn't something we were going to talk about, but I'm curious.
Only here.
Okay.
Yeah,
Your brain.
it's only here.
Okay.
Very it keeps me awake, but yes, thank you. I may
Well,
go back to writing short stories for a while.
yeah, bridge that time in between until that voice is clear.
Yes, yes.
Well, thank you again. I appreciate you being
Thank
here.
you.
Listeners, thank you for tuning in. You can get this episode on our website, aroundthewriterstable.com. You can hear it on all of the different podcasting platforms, Spotify, Google Play, and also on YouTube. So thank you again, Pat. We look forward to our next episode, and
Thank you.
bye, listeners. Take care.
Thanks for joining us around the writer's table. Please feel free to suggest a topic or a guest by emailing info@aroundthewriterstable.com. Music provided with gracious permission by Langtree. A link to their music is on our homepage at aroundthewriterstable.com. Everyone here around the Writer's Table wishes you joy in your writing and everyday grace in your living. Take care until next time.